Thank you so much for having me. Great presentation so far, fascinating stuff. My name is Jacob Ware, and I'm a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, as well as at DeSales University. The title of my talk is Rhino Hunting, Internecine Assassination and Terrorism Within the American Far Right. My talk includes what I hope is a deliberately provocative title, but it's actually a quote from a video released in June 2022 by a Republican candidate for the Senate in Missouri, U.S. Senate in Missouri, Eric Greitens, in which he threatened to hunt political rivals who he had derided as Republicans in name only, or rhino. "We're going rhino hunting," Greitens, proudly holding a shotgun, declares as he follows a SWAT-style team into an empty house. "Get a rhino hunting permit. There's no bagging limit, no tagging limit, and it doesn't expire until we save our country." In other words, we see an open-ended invitation to hunt political opponents using firearms until some kind of self-defined triumph. That ad was removed from Facebook and labeled with warnings on Twitter, and it eventually contributed to his defeat in that election. But it was emblematic of a broader, dangerous trend on the political far right, a rise in threats of violence issued within the far right fringe against right-wing opponents deemed insufficiently pure, committed, and loyal. Typically, we think of far-right extremism and far-right terrorism as constituting threats from the far right against the left, from extremists in quotation marks who are Republicans against Democrats, from white supremacists against minorities. Those descriptions might all be true, but the Greitens case is just one of many recent examples of Republican politicians and other leaders at the federal level being threatened by extremists on the right. On January 6th, of course, pipe bombs targeted the Republican National Committee office as well as the Democrat counterpart. Two Republicans who went on to serve on the House of Representatives investigation into the attack, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, both received a flood of threats, the latter even receiving a call that warned, "I'm going to get your wife, I'm going to get your kids." More recently, a rival candidate, Nikki Haley, requested Secret Service protection due to the volume of threats that she was facing, including 2 swatting incidents around the new year. Federal judges involved in January 6th cases, meanwhile, have received threats for their service. According to Reuters, one judge who was actually appointed by Ronald Reagan and had previously been threatened by Al-Qaeda was warned, "Traitors get ropes." Now, before I dive in too far, a quick disclaimer. I consider myself quite fortunate because I study counterterrorism, which means I get to draw a relatively defined line over what I can and cannot study. And the key differentiator in my study and in my talk today is not any single policy or party that I might disagree with and therefore can blandish as some kind of other or as extremist. The key differentiator in my study always is violence. Every individual I will cover has opted to advocate for or accept or threaten or tolerate or themselves conduct violence in order to overthrow or undermine democratic processes. That is a line that all of us, regardless of party or policy, should be able to agree on. I loved what Professor Rudisil said earlier. The value is non-violence. Now, this particular symposium covers mainstreaming extremism in US state and other public institutions, so I want to narrow down on my data. In addition to those cases targeting federal level officials, as I already discussed, we have also seen multiple cases targeting state and local officials. Perhaps the most prominent case comes out of Georgia. In the aftermath of the certification of President Biden's general election victory in Georgia in 2020, leading Republican state officials, including Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Voting Systems Implementation Manager Gabriel Sterling, received floods of death threats from other Republicans or Trump supporters. The former's wife, for instance, received a text message warning, "You and your family will be killed very slowly." In Arizona, the Republican county recorder of Maricopa County faced a deluge of threats after his election in 2021, so after January 6th. Let me read a paragraph excerpt from a Vox deep dive into his service in Arizona over the past few years. By 2022, when Riker was presiding over the November election ballot tally, his office was fortified like a military base, surrounded by armed police deployed to protect him and his staff from threats. And he was he recalls numerous staff members quitting on the spot after heated confrontations, and he was personally targeted by credible threats. When he spoke to me, he was about to testify in one of 3 federal cases against people who had vowed to kill him. "You need to do your job right because other people from other states are watching you," the man allegedly said in a voicemail. "You renege on this deal or give them any more troubles, your ass will never make it to your next little board meeting." In another case in Arizona, a member of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, who is now departing his role, made the mistake of posting a family photo on social media. According to the Guardian newspaper, a Trump supporter responded that his daughter should be raped. Despite one tormentor accusing him of being a corrupt Democrat, quote, corrupt Democrat, he told the Guardian that he is a lifelong Republican. "I'm a true child of the Reagan Revolution," he told the newspaper. He also notes that he has been particularly hurt by the fact that threats have come from his own side of the aisle. "It's my team that's coming after me," he said. 4 of us supervisors are Republicans in Maricopa. We stood up for democracy. We stood up for elections that are safe and secure. And we've been called rhinos, traitors, Marxist communists on a daily basis. In another case, in Texas, Republican Congressman Randy Weber was threatened after the 2020 election by a rival, Keith Casey, who has run multiple times as Weber's primary opponent in the Republican primary. Casey claimed he had been, quote, exiled from office and was going to take Weber down. Notably, the growing acceptance of violence, particularly assassination threats, as a means to exercise political grievances is also supported by data. Lawmakers at the federal level now report spending record numbers on their own security details, with the Washington Post reporting candidates running for House and Senate offices increased campaign spending on security by more than 500% between the 2020 election and the 2022 midterms. Mitt Romney, for one, spends $5,000 a day on his personal security detail. Capitol Police investigated over 8,000 threats against members of Congress last year, an increase over the previous year, but lower than the 9,000 plus threats issued in 2021. According to leading scholars Pete Simi and Seamus Hughes, over the past 10 years, more than 500 individuals have been arrested for threatening public officials, and that trend line is shooting up. These scholars call the rise in threats and the impact it has on willingness to serve the slow burn threatening our democracy. Finally, an ABC News study from 2020 found 41 cases of violence inspired by President Trump over the previous 5 years. This was despite the fact that ABC News could find not a single criminal case filed in federal or state court where an act of violence or threat was made in the name of President Barack Obama or President George W. Bush. As an interesting side note, less related to my remarks on hunting rhinos, we also see the violent far right target other institutions typically cherished by American conservatives, including law enforcement and the United States military. The anti-government and anti-law enforcement vein of far-right extremism that led to the deadliest domestic terrorist incident in US history, that being the 1995 bombing of Oklahoma City's Alfred P. Murrah building, has resurfaced as a result of Trump's legal troubles as the FBI has fallen into the crosshairs. One Trump supporter attempted to attack the FBI headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2022, for instance. We've also seen attacks against the military, perhaps most notably an attack that was already mentioned by my colleague Hope, which in 2020 involved the neo-Nazi US Army private Ethan Melzer, who attempted to inspire an al-Qaeda attack on his own unit during deployment in Europe. He was arrested for attempting to murder US service members, providing and attempting to provide material support to terrorists, and illegally transmitting national defense information. To conclude the first, more descriptive part of my remarks, then, I'd like to make the following suggestion. The American violent far right is not just a threat to the American left or to American minority communities, but it is in fact an internecine, fratricidal threat to the American right itself, in turn presenting a broader threat to American liberal democracy and the functioning of the democratic order itself. Now, in order to look at this issue a bit more analytically, I thought it would be interesting and worthwhile to borrow a framing laid out by scholars Barbara Walter and Andrew Kidd in their 2006 International Security article on the strategies of terrorism. The author suggests first and foremost that terrorism is violence as political activism. It's a strategic decision taken by activists who feel they have exhausted all other options. More specifically, they find that there are 5 strategies of terrorism, and I'll quickly go through them. In an attrition strategy, terrorists seek to persuade the enemy that the terrorists are strong enough to impose considerable costs if the enemy continues a particular policy. A provocation strategy is an attempt to induce the enemy to respond to terrorism with indiscriminate violence, which radicalizes the population and moves them to support the terrorists. We've also seen intimidation strategies. Terrorists using intimidation try to convince the population that the terrorists are strong enough to punish disobedience and that the government is too weak to stop them, so that people behave as the terrorists wish. Then you have spoiling. Spoilers attack in an effort to persuade the enemy that moderates on the terrorist side are weak and untrustworthy, thus undermining attempts to reach a peace settlement. Finally, groups engaged in outbidding use violence to convince the public that the terrorists have greater resolve to fight the enemy than rival groups and therefore are worthy of support. Attrition, provocation, intimidation, spoiling, and outbidding. In my experience studying terrorism and counterterrorism, most modern violence seeks to advance those first 2 strategies, attrition and provocation. Salafi jihadist terrorism, such as the 9/11 attacks or Orlando shootings, are good examples. They seek to provoke overwhelming responses against the attacker's constituency, which will aim to inspire an uprising. October 7th in Israel is another good example. These attacks might also aim to push the West into withdrawing from certain lands by convincing them that more violence is inevitable, the attrition strategy. You can also see such strategies in far-right white supremacist attacks, such as the attacks at Charleston, South Carolina, which aim to provoke a race war, or Buffalo, New York. Interestingly, though, internecine fratricidal terrorism from the right against the right, as described above, actually seems to advance the other 3 strategies: intimidation, spoiling, and outbidding. Let me briefly explain each one of those using one prominent example. So firstly, intimidation. Now, the front cover of my newly published book on far-right terrorism in America, called God, Guns, and Sedition, which you can see over my left shoulder, shows the noose erected outside the US Capitol on January 6th. Now, that noose was not necessarily intended for any of the liberals often castigated by the MAGA movement, but in fact for a conservative, evangelical, Republican Vice President, Mike Pence. In fact, whether or not you would agree with an argument that former President Trump inspired or directed or was responsible for that attack, you can clearly see the intimidation strategy at work in his own speech delivered at the Ellipse that day. In fact, the marching orders he dispatched to his followers that day were targeted primarily at Republicans, not at Democrats. Let me quote the end of the speech that he delivered at the Ellipse. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to go to the Capitol. And we're going to try and give, the Democrats are hopeless. They never vote for anything, not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try to give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take our country back. He would double down in a tweet sent at 2:24 p.m. that day. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. The crowd, of course, famously chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." Pence was placed in mortal danger that day, all in the strategic goal of coercing him to break the law on behalf of the violent extremist movement. Now, although the intimidation strategy did not work against the vice president, it has worked in other cases related to January 6th. One Republican former member of Congress who voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th wrote in an op-ed, "My colleague feared for family members and the danger the vote would put them in." As Zach Beauchamp wrote in the previously mentioned Vox deep dive on this issue, the threat of violence is now a part of the American political system, to the point where Republican officials are, by their own admissions, changing the way they behave because they fear it. We've also seen spoiling. Let me use an example from Ohio. In October, during the Republican Party's Speaker of the House race, Ohio's Jim Jordan stood for election. When he failed to gain the necessary votes, opponents of his candidacy were targeted with a flood of death threats. In fact, according to the Associated Press, every lawmaker who voted against Jordan received a barrage of angry phone calls and messages. One fellow Republican congressman predicted that the holdouts would cave after suffering a, quote, meat grinder of pressure. While there clearly was an effort to intimidate opponents into voting for the extremist preferred candidate, a spoiling message was also being issued. Kevin McCarthy's ouster and Jordan's candidacy were, of course, fundamentally about demanding more uncompromising actions in relations with Democrats, about spoiling the kind of bipartisan compromise that had led to the continuing resolution leading to McCarthy's ouster in the first place. Finally, we've also seen that outbidding strategy. In just one example of a case which fortunately did not result in tangible violence, in October 2022, former President Trump wrote on his Truth Social page that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell had a death wish due to the latter's agreement to a government funding plan. Again, there was, of course, an effort to intimidate opponents, but this was also an effort to outbid, or what you might call in political parlance, outmaneuver McConnell to show Trump's followers that his actions would be more uncompromising and therefore more worthy of their support. We see then that far-right violent extremism uses a range of terroristic strategies to advance their end goals, and they are quite willing to deploy violence against rivals on the right as part of their strategy. I want to be clear. This is not a bug, it's a feature. It's a crucial segment of the violence and has often been underreported. I see three implications of this finding. Firstly, I want to reflect for a moment on the nature of the strategies of this violence. Provocation and attrition strategies tend to involve grand ambitions of changing society through revolutionary violence. I'm not sure intimidation, spoiling, and outbidding do involve those great grand ambitions. They seem more narrow, more about coercing or compelling behavior among individuals. I think that puts these politicians in even greater danger because individuals seem to believe that even low-level changes, low-level violence, affecting one or two votes can have that greater impact. And so they can actually imagine the end goal of their acts of violence. The second implication relevant to this year is that the violent far right has always had close relationships with mainstream politics, particularly in election cycles. Now, if you look back at the previous three new presidents in the United States, that's Presidents Obama, President Trump, and President Biden, each of them had considerable impacts on the violent far right. President Obama, perhaps unsurprisingly, led to a rise in white supremacist activity and violence. He actually requested and received Secret Service protection earlier than any other candidate in US history. and unfortunately catalyzed a string of far-right white supremacist attacks, perhaps most notably at Charleston. President Trump's election doubled down on that rise in white supremacist and anti-government activity and violence, perhaps more from a feeling of emboldening. And from there, we saw a wave of violence in places like Charlottesville, Virginia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Poway, California, El Paso, Texas, and of course, January 6th, as well as attacks abroad. President Biden's election, we know, leads to a rise in anti-government extremism, particularly election denialism, resulting in January 6th. That matters this year because we're in an election year. And if history is going to be a guide, we should expect to see acts of violence inspired by political movements this year. And if my findings are right, that violence is going to include threats against the American right. The third implication is actually a relatively optimistic one. Politics in America often seems polarizing and sclerotic, incapable of movement despite clear calamity on the horizon. But the issue that I write about or speak about today and I write about in my piece is not a question of politics. It really is a question of counterterrorism. It's not a question of Republican versus Democrat, right versus left, but of a small extremist fringe versus actually everyone else in our liberal democracy. The more we can make the case that these violent extremists threaten Republicans too, the more I believe we will garner support in our efforts to combat this dangerous, violent movement. After all, Republicans and other right-wing lives depend on it as well. Thank you so much.